Hello, friends, and welcome back for our second week of our Advent study of Luke. And we are continuing to look at the Christmas story through the lens of the Gospel of Luke, as we also journey along with author Timothy Clayton in his book, Exploring Advent with Luke. As we come to week 2, we are getting into the story of Mary. And so I could not think of any more appropriate place to film this video than in front of the beautiful blue pyramids in our sanctuary and with the image of Christ that so often looks down on us during worship behind me as well in our beautiful stained glass window. The blue that we're using this Advent is a color that traditionally represents the incarnation and represents Mary. So it reminds us of the fact that Mary is seen as the mother of God and as really the conduit for God's presence in the world. And that's what we claim in the incarnation, that in some special way Jesus comes and is born to show us what it is to dwell with God, what it is for God to come alongside humanity and be among us. And so Mary holds a special place in the story, a special place in the history of church and liturgy. And this year we have chosen to use the blue in our sanctuary as well. And that's one of the things that it reminds us of in this season of Advent. Last week we were confronted with the story of Zechariah and the announcement to Zechariah and Elizabeth that they would be bearing a son who would be John the Baptist. And we thought a bit about the silence and solitude that they spent their time in preparing both for that birth of John the Baptist and for what was to come. This week, we are going to read through the story of Mary being encountered by Gabriel and what that experience entails according to the Gospel of Luke and some of the things that it helps us think about this season of Advent. One of the major things that we are going to be looking at and thinking about today is the fact that this idea of the Spirit of God or the presence of God completely overwhelming Mary, that God comes to dwell in not only her midst, but literally that she is going to bear this child that will be God in the world. And the overshadowing language that is used in the story here has a lot of resonance all the way back to the Old Testament, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But the fact that God's presence came to dwell on the tabernacle in the midst of the Israelites' presence as they were escaping Egypt and making their way along the Exodus. We'll also hear about the fact that the overshadowing language also shows up when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain in front of the disciples, revealing Jesus' special place as both being human and divine, as giving us a window or a glimpse into the divine presence in the midst of the real world. And our challenge for this week is going to be, how do we think about the idea of God's presence being in our midst? Are we able to open ourselves to that kind of radical trust that we get a glimpse of through this story of Mary and Mary's encounter with the angel Gabriel, where Mary says, let this happen if it's going to happen. And what is it to believe that God can be at work in our lives in radical ways? And so where last week's question was, what kinds of time and silence and solitude and space can we make to try to give God some space to operate in our lives? Now it's really, do our lives have space for God? That's really our question this week. Do we really have the space in our hearts and in our minds and in our lives to believe that God could indeed actually be at work in some real, tangible, and radical way? And I think that this is one of the real struggles for a lot of people today. One of the things that we looked a little bit last week about some of the things that might make it hard for people to get into the Advent story and the Christmas story and really help it come alive. Well, I think one of the challenges for all of us in our spiritual journeys is how do we really embrace this notion of God present in our lives? How do we open ourselves to see God present in our lives? Do we believe that God is present in our lives? And if so, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for what God might already be doing? What does it mean for where God might be leading us? What does it mean for how our lives might need to change, might need to grow, might need to expand, might need to be renewed? And so those are all of the questions and things that we're going to think about today. I hope you enjoyed this second week of study as you focus a little more on Mary's encounter with the angel Gabriel. And I hope you have a blessed Advent in this week to come. Thanks so much, and I will see you next week.